Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Wendy, I can't see you. Is that my, oh, hi.
Nope. It's me, but I can't see myself, so who knows what I look like.
Perfect. Perfect. Oh.
13.
We are just about to go live. Uh-oh. So we're having a little bit of trouble with the live stream here, but all right. Well, it is good to see you all here this morning. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. We're going to cancel that so I can see all of your amazing faces. I'll move this over so you can see me. There I am. Good to see you guys, and we're going to get started. So we're going to be looking at the Road to Emmaus story, which is from the Gospel of Luke. It's chapter 24, verses 13 through 35, as we've been kind of continuing our story on our post-resurrection story. So we were in John for 2 weeks. We looked at John 20 and John 21, and now we're kind of moving into, so I got Sue here, and now we're moving into Luke. So we're going to talk a little bit just about Luke and give a little bit of background there before we jump in. We've got some other folks that are joining us right now. Hi, Sue. Good to see you this morning. Looks like we finally went live here on Facebook. Nancy Knott and Dave Donnelly are with us. So we're just going to let everybody kind of hop in and join us here. Morning. Can you guys all hear me okay? Whoa. Sorry about that. All right. And Lois is joining us. So let's begin with just I want to start us off with some prayer as we kind of gather ourselves in a spirit of prayer as more folks are joining us. Are there any joys or concerns that you have that you want to share with the community? Yeah, Donna. Oh, hold on, you're muted. Let me unmute you. There you go. Go again. You're good. I got you.
Jan Laverne, who used to join us, had the back pain. Yeah. She got a shot last week. It helped her for a couple days, but she's back to awful back pain again. So if we could keep her in prayer, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. I'm so sorry to hear that. I was hoping that shot would help some things. So gosh, thank you for lifting me up.
Well, thanks.
Other prayers.
I got a prayer of Thanksgiving, I guess, on behalf of Joy Burney. Her mother is too well to be in hospice, so she's coming home to be back with Joy and Tom. So that's a joy.
That's great. Yeah.
Celebration. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Who else has any other joys or concerns? Continued prayers for the son of a friend of mine, Anthony, who is in the hospital and looks like he's going to be starting chemotherapy. So please keep Anthony in your prayers as he's undergoing treatment. And his mom's able to be with him, but nobody else is. So, and welcome to Sarah Robinson and Carrie O'Leary, who are also with us on Facebook.
That's great.
All right. Well, let's gather these thoughts and prayers. I'm just going to check Facebook, give them a moment if they have any extra prayers they want to put in. I'm not seeing that. So I want to gather us in a prayer. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the road to Emmaus. It's Luke 24, verses 13 through 32. So let's pray. God of love and life, be with us, be among us, be within us. God, we come before you with much on our hearts, that which is spoken and that which remains silently within us. We ask for your continuing prayers of healing and presence and wholeness to hold Jan as she continues to experience such pain, to be with Anthony and his family as they are in need of your healing presence. God, our cup overflows with the joy that we celebrate with Joy Burney and her mother's homecoming and how well that her health is. And we know that there is great concern in the world, physical concern as so many continue to suffer from this horrible pandemic, financial concern as we hear frightening economic numbers being released today, as we have heard that half of all people in the United States, half have either lost their job or experienced a reduction in wages or hours. And it all just seems too great for us to hold. It is too much for us. And so once again, God, we return to Thanksgiving because it's not just up to us. But we know that you are within us and give us strength that we cannot even conceive or imagine. You give us each other to support one another, to show your loving presence when we feel that we cannot see you. And for this great community, we give you thanks. God, guide us and meet us on the road to Emmaus. Guide us on this path toward our destination and renew our strength as we continue to walk in communion with you. Open our eyes so that we see signs of your presence around us. Open our hearts that we may receive your peace and love. And empower us to pass on to others the grace that you continue to share with us so freely. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So let's talk. Yeah, the audio is going to be a little weird. Sorry that we have folks that are like, the audio is weird. Apparently our connection is not the best that it could be. I'm going to just invite some folks to join us. How's the audio on Zoom? Can you guys
It's
hear me?
been spotty.
I'm not cutting in or out?
No, you
You are
are
cutting.
cutting in and out.
I am cutting in and out. Oh, that's good to know. Let me see what's going on there. I'll just try this. Can you guys hear me better? Am I not cutting in and out now?
Yes, right now.
Okay, good. Hopefully that's a little bit better. All right. So we'll try that instead. All right. Yeah, if something like that comes up, just let me know because we'll try to see how we can adjust that on the fly, and hopefully that's a little better. So who would like to, we're going to read again, we're in the Gospel of Luke, and before we hear this, so a little bit of a different gospel for sure. So Luke is one of the synoptic gospels. Synoptic because syn, which is same, optic, how they look, so they look similar, right? So they have a lot of the similar stories. We have 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what we know is that, or what we're pretty sure of, is that Mark was written first, and that Matthew and Luke, when those were being written, the authors of Matthew and Luke had Mark in front of them. And so a lot of those stories from Mark get kind of more detailed, they get fleshed out a bit more in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And so we have these kind of broader stories that come out of there. Mark is obviously the smallest gospel, and then Matthew and Luke are a little bit larger. And then they also had another thing, another source, another gospel, something that we've lost, that we don't have, that's called the Q source. And so that contained different elements that we find only in Matthew and Luke. They're not in the Gospel of Mark, but clearly Matthew and Luke shared those. For example, the Sermon on the Mount, right? So the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, while different in Matthew and Luke, they both contain this kind of sermon. Matthew, it's a huge sermon. Luke's is a sermon on the plain, but we know that doesn't appear in Mark. It's a little bit different. And so, so that's why we call them synoptic. There's a lot of similar stories in how they look. But as we mentioned, I think last week or the week before, while Matthew, Mark, and Luke share a lot of the same stories, they're also, when it comes to the post-resurrection stories, they're amazingly different. The resurrection and what happens after are remarkably different between even the synoptics, all four gospels. And so a lot of the stories that we know and love, we remember from one gospel, and you may look for those in the other gospels and they just don't appear. Today's story is one of those, the road to Emmaus, which is one that some of you may be familiar with, you may have heard before. That road to Emmaus story is only in the Gospel of Luke, similar to how the story of doubting Thomas is only in the Gospel of John, or for example, the Great Commission that we're going to be looking at next week is only in the Gospel of Matthew. So, so a lot of these stories are kind of interesting, where we only get it's only in one gospel, and I find it fascinating that there's such a variety in the resurrection and post-resurrection appearances. A couple other things to know about the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke has a broader kind of focus. The Gospel of Matthew is more focused on the Jewish community. It's a little bit more tied in, most likely from a Syrian Jewish community is where the Gospel of Matthew emerges. So you see that the focus on Jesus as the new Moses. We see the focus on Jesus as the new Moses, on tying the lineage of Jesus to the lineage of David, and we see those pieces come in the Gospel of Matthew. Luke is a lot broader, right? So Luke, we trace the lineage of Jesus all the way back to Adam and Abraham. We go back quite a bit further when we get to Luke, so that we want to kind of encompass all people. Luke, we have, if you remember, all the way back to Christmas, right? That Luke is a savior of the world and the Prince of Peace for the world. So we've kind of this much broader focus in Luke. There are other things about people say, like, well, Luke was the physician and who traveled with Paul, and that's why there's more of a Gentile focus and all of that. Those are all possible. There's really no evidence of that. We have no idea who wrote any of the Gospels. We have some kind of clues, so we think that Matthew is written more from a early Syrian Jewish community, from some of the syntax and pieces. We know that Luke was written probably by a community that was not familiar, not indigenous to the Palestinian area and Galilee or Jerusalem, because Luke's geography is just terrible. So he probably didn't know that. So there are some clues that we get in there, but ultimately we just don't know. And that goes for all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We attribute names of the apostles to them, but we really have no evidence that that Mark was written by Mark, John, as we hear about next, or that Matthew was written by the disciple Matthew, or that Luke was written by the physician that traveled. Any sort of exploration into who exactly the author is, I mean, it's the best guess that we have, but it's still kind of interesting from what we got. All right, any other questions just about the Gospel of Luke before we jump into today's reading? We're going to jump in. Would somebody like to read for us this morning? Don't all volunteer at once. I'm going to tell them.
I can do it.
That would be great. Thank you, Wendy. So we're going to be in Luke. Again, it's at the end of the Gospel of Luke. Luke is the third Gospel in the New Testament. We're in chapter 24. We're going to read verse 13 through 35. Thanks, Wendy.
You're welcome. For what it's worth, my Bible is the New International Version.
Great.
Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they had replied. He was a prophet, powerful in the world and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it, just as the women had said, but him they did not see. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread.
Great, thank you. So let's start with what speaks to you in the reading? What stands out to you? What do you find compelling or interesting or disturbing or strange or any of those things?
For me, it's verse 28.
Mm-hmm.
I love that they're approaching the village to where they were going and Jesus was going farther.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so true that we have our own destinations in life, and Jesus is helping us see a broader journey, and helping us through those journeys we don't anticipate or don't even want to go on.
Yep.
What's troubling in my translation is that it says Jesus acted as if he were going farther. So that confuses me a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that it's a weird thing in the Greek where it's one of the like we don't know if Jesus is actually going farther, but he anticipates that he's going farther. But yeah, I love that idea that is Jesus constantly calling us further, calling us beyond ourselves, calling us to something else, to newer horizons. Yeah. What else? Anything else stand out?
Yeah, what struck me was on verse 25, and it just seemed like Jesus was a little harsh on his disciples. And I'm not sure it's the translation or what. I guess basically it was that they weren't, after I guess all they had witnessed and what they had been told, I guess they still didn't believe, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But
the Greek is even better. It basically says, Jesus just says, "You idiots." It's awesome. It's harsh. It's harsh.
well, okay, there I get.
Yeah. It actually gets muted a little bit in the English. It's a harsher kind of you morons.
So it's done kind of a brotherly love type, like I would say to my brother, like, okay,
right.
All right, okay,
yeah.
Interesting. Brotherly and sisterly, of course. I don't know.
Karen, how about you? You said you looked like you had something too that stood out.
You know what? I was just going to talk about say something about verse 29, where Wendy was at, when the disciples urged him strongly to stay.
Yep.
I don't know. I was just kind of struck with needing to ask Jesus to be with you, or God to be with you.
Yeah.
I don't know. Because I too was. It's an interesting little verse.
Yeah.
Acting like you're going to move on, I'm going to leave, but please stay.
Right.
And of course, once they recognized him, he disappears. So that's also interesting and beautiful at the same time. So
Yeah.
that's all.
Yeah. That's no, it's an odd thing. We're going to jump into that a bit. Yeah, that's a good point.
I always love that it is in the breaking of bread that they recognize him. And so often people say, well, the table is open for those who believe. And I like to cite this saying, no, it's in the breaking of the bread and in the communing that we often come to believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Dave Donnelly had picked that up too, had said something similar to that, where he said, yeah, that spoke to him, that it was in the breaking of the bread that they first saw Jesus. Well, we're going to dig into this a little bit more, kind of walk through this a little bit together. And thank you for sharing that. And obviously, if you're joining us for one of the first times or something, just chime in or raise your hand or interrupt me if you got something to say. So don't hesitate for that. And all questions are good questions. So Emmaus is, so a lot of people wonder, like, where's Emmaus? We don't really know. It's a tiny little village that we know was probably north of Jerusalem. But we don't know exactly where it was. We just know it was a small village outside. We know that Jerusalem, right? These are small villages. Jerusalem was smaller, and Emmaus was even smaller than Jerusalem. But there are a couple strange things that are happening here. So from the very beginning, first of all, we've been, ever since the crucifixion, we've been really focused on who people are, right? So we, after the crucifixion and the resurrection, we know who went to the tomb. It was, the Marys who went to the tomb, and Salome. And so we hear those stories about who Jesus is appearing to. But here we just have two people, and we don't know which two they are. They begin as unnamed. Later we find out that one of them is named Cleopas. And you all remember Cleopas from earlier in the gospel, right?
No.
No. He's never mentioned anywhere else. So we have no idea who Cleopas is. In fact, John Dominic Crossan said it could be Cleopas and his wife. It could be a husband and wife. We just don't know. It's often assumed that it's two men, but we don't know if it's two men. It's very unclear about who this is. And I think especially as it begins, there's a gift in that what the post-resurrection stories do is they talk about inviting the church in, right? And so it's two people who are on a journey, and they know Jesus, but they haven't experienced Jesus, right? They've heard these things, but they're still grieved. And so there's this way of, like, which two disciples is it? Well, it could be you and me, it could be Lorraine and Wendy. It could be, so there is an intentionality, especially at the beginning of this, that really, that's very specific, and because it's meant to kind of invite you into it, into that story. So they're walking, they're talking about all these things that happen. They come and they find someone who is, it says it was Jesus. This is, by the way, an ancient literary trope. This is very common that happens. And so probably one of the best examples of this is, how many of you had to read the Odyssey when you were in high school at some point, right? So when Odysseus returns home, right, he disguises himself so no one can see him. So he's back, he's returned, but he's not really returned because he's in disguise. So by the way, this is very tropey, just so you know, like, this isn't like, this is new, like, this is very common, especially in Greek literature, that the hero returns, but you can't see him. Also, let's be honest, this is also something that we see in almost every post-resurrection experience, where originally they don't recognize. So think back to when Jesus appears to them in the upper room, and at first they don't know if it's Jesus, right? So that's the first thing. When Jesus appears to Mary in the garden in John 20, in the early half of John 20 on Easter morning, she thinks he's the gardener. She doesn't recognize who it is. When they're having their feast on the beach that we talked about last time, again, they see Jesus on the shore talking to them, but they don't recognize it's Jesus until the beloved disciple points that out. So this is all it's a very common theme also in these post-resurrection experiences, that they don't see that Christ is in their midst, and then all of a sudden Christ is revealed. Now, as I mentioned, there's a bit of a literary tropiness in it, that's offset by the fact that when the hero is revealed, right? So when Odysseus is revealed to be Odysseus and is then, what does he do? He overthrows the bad people and claims his kingdom. Is that what Jesus does? Now, what happens when Jesus is revealed?
He gets killed.
Disappears. Right? Almost every time he's revealed and then shortly after goes. And I want to call back to something that Rob Routson had pointed out that I love that Cynthia Bogolt had mentioned, which is that Jesus only appears for as long as he's needed and in his post-resurrection, and then he goes away. And I love that idea of this because here in this piece, he's meeting these travelers on the road to Emmaus. They're on the road. They're on their, we say, whoever you are, wherever you are on life's journey, right? So these are people on the journey of life and faith. Christ has met them in the midst of their doubt, in the midst of their grief, has been with them and shows them that they're not alone in their journey, that he continues to be with them, right? And I think that's the piece where there's a beautiful, he is not usually there's a trickster aspect in the literary form of the person in disguise. That's not what Jesus is doing here. While we might expect that, instead what we see is Jesus is doing to provide hope and joy and remind people that they're not alone. One of the comforting, cool pieces I find of that is that there's debate, and we talked about this before, is the question is, was it really Jesus who appeared to them on the road to Emmaus, or was it someone else who appeared to them? And what they recognized was that in the process, so if we look at this whole story, they meet a stranger on the road, they share their experience of where they're at, they listen to the scriptures, they talk about the scriptures, then they have fellowship together. There's an element of service in which they reach out to someone who is in need of shelter and welcome them into their homes. And then they break bread together. And in that process of, I know this is an extraordinary thing, we couldn't even begin to imagine, of gathering with strangers to hear scripture, to pray together, to serve one another, to break bread together. And in that whole process, realizing that Jesus is in the midst of this, that Jesus is present, right? What does that sound like?
Church.
Yeah. So what's happening here is this is church. This is church before there's church. It's literally it's one of the cool things. The road to Emmaus is like the first worship service, right? They come together and they come as they are. I once was at a church and the pastor would always say, take all of your concerns and stresses and just leave them outside the door and just bring yourself before God, which it drove me nuts because I'm like, that sounds good. But then when I leave the sanctuary, I just got to pick them back up again. Like they're not going anywhere. And this is a passage where they are heartbroken. They are confused. They are grieving, and they bring that, just like we bring that to church, to our community, to our Bible study. We're to bring who we are, right? When we say that, whoever you are, sometimes we come to church and we come to worship and we are just on cloud nine and we know that God is right there next to us, beside us, within us, comforting us, and we're feeling great and riding high. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm spiritually limping into church full of fear and doubt and agony and all of those things that these early disciples are feeling. And it's in there, in hearing the word, in discussing the word, interpreting the word, and then that moves them to what? Open their hearts and open their homes to receive the stranger, this act of service, which is central to our worship. And then that of course moves into this beautiful breaking of the bread. And so it's this beautiful idea of this first worship service in this microcosm. I just want to pause there and see if there's questions or thoughts or comments that stand out to folks. I'm also going to let my dog out because she's right behind me and she's going to start whining and barking. So,
one of the questions I've got is, again, I get maybe putting on my scientific hat, trying to do some math here, so Jesus met two disciples on the road, but then later on, they got up and they found the 11. So
Right.
it sounds like 13 people
Yeah.
involved here. So it's
Great point. Good point. And I love, yeah, and good close reading to the text, which is really good. So how many disciples were there?
12.
We usually think 12, right?
Right.
But actually, so if we look at the concentric circles of the followers of Jesus, we have the crowds, right? So that's just the general crowds. And then the next subset within there are the disciples. And the disciples simply means the students of Jesus. So the word disciples means students. It's the students of Jesus. And so we go from the crowds to the students of Jesus. Okay. And then from those students of Jesus, we have 70 that are chosen to be apostles. And so then we have the apostles. Now, apostle comes from the Greek word apostoleo, which means to be sent. Those are the ones, remember when Jesus sends out 70, 2 by 2 to all the towns and says, don't take anything with you. So that's where then you have the apostles. Then of the apostles, we're getting to a smaller group, which is the 12, which is not the same as the disciples. We think of them as synonymous. They're not synonymous. It's not the same. Give me just a second. Thank you. My dog feels the need to keep walking in and out of my office, which is great. So my kids are screaming. So then you have the disciples. Then among the disciples, so you have the, again, crowd, disciples, apostles, the 12, the 3. In the Synoptic Gospels, we have the 3, which is Peter and James and John. And then also there, in kind of that same way, you also have Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene is the apostle to the apostle. She's the one who brings the news of the resurrection, even if the apostles, like we hear in today's story, are not smart enough to actually listen. But she has this high role in there. And a lot has been written and read into what that is. Like maybe she was the wife of Jesus, maybe she was all these other things, maybe. And so that we don't know. We just know that she has this kind of elevated role within that early Christian community. So when we hear that there were 2 disciples, right, there were more than just the 12. The 12 are a subset of a much larger group of disciples. So the word disciple just again means it's synonymous with the word student. It's the Greek word for student. It starts with an M, and right now it escapes me. But so that's why when we hear, so it's those earlier followers will soon become known as the followers of the way. So that's what the early church, before we called them Christians or anything else, the early followers of Jesus after the resurrection were known as followers of the way of Jesus Christ, because they were Jewish. Remember, all those the early followers, they were all Jewish, and so they were Jewish followers of the way of Jesus Christ. And so he was the rabbi, right? So we hear in the scriptures that they often call him rabbi or teacher. And so they are he is their teacher. They're following his way as his students. So yeah, it's a good catch though, because it is a weird thing when you're like, wait, so how many disciples are there, right? So there's a piece here that, this is probably one of the things. So it says they came along and he asked them, what are they discussing? This is where we get Cleopas' name. Are you the only one who doesn't know these things that have taken place? He gives this brief synopsis of Jesus's life. What things? Jesus of Nazareth, a prophet, mighty in word and deed before God and all people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. And then this is the piece for me that hits me deeply, right in the heart, which is at verse 21. This is the part but we had hoped. It's such a painful and beautiful and heartbreaking phrase, I find, but we had hoped. And I love that phrase because it's so honest there are few things in this life as devastating as feeling like you have hoped in vain. Right? So we had hoped that he would be the one, and you can just, I don't know, in that I hear that longing of, we had hoped that he would be the one who would liberate us from from Rome and from the oppression of Rome. We had hoped that he would be the one who would restore the kingdom of Israel. We had hoped that he would inaugurate and bring about the kingdom of God. We had hoped, we had all these dreams and hopes, and we've seen them all shattered. They're all done. It's all over. And I don't know, I feel like it's almost worse than the valley of the shadow of death, because it's just, they're in this state of just hopelessness, of just emptiness, of just feeling like there is nowhere. They're returning home because there's nothing else to do and nowhere left to go.
Or their stay-at-home order.
Yeah, right. They're returning at home with their masks in place.
I mean, it's kind of a feeling, so many plans and things that we all have had over the last, these next few months and probably beyond that are not happening, and kind of leads to a sense of despair, because those hopes are those temporal hopes anyway aren't there.
Yeah, I have 3 weddings in May. And I guarantee that the 3 weddings I have in May had hoped that they could have more than 6 people at their wedding. But they can't. Sorry. Okay. So it's and all of the people too. I mean, the thing that devastates me, I think that hits me, especially in the midst of this pandemic, has been those who are sick and those who are dying who are alone. And there's also a deep loneliness in this, right? So the disciples, they've been in this great community, and what's happened? The community is breaking and people are going off alone.
Last week, we talked about them being in the upper room and still being in the upper room, even though they had been told to go out.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, that was their place of grieving. It was where they were hanging together, sharing their grief.
Yeah.
And now they're,
Bless you.
just beginning to go out.
Yeah. But here I find this is the funny thing, or odd thing, is we go from the devastation of verse 21 to the oddity of verse 22, right? We had hoped that these things would happen, but he was dead. But then some women came and they said that he was alive, right? I mean, it's just, so then they astounded us, and they were at the tomb this morning and they did not find his body there. And they came back and told us indeed that there was a vision of angels and that he was alive. And those of us went to the tomb and found it, as the women said, but we didn't see them. Right? And so like, there's also this piece of, but you received good news. You received that like this isn't over, that there is an opportunity, there is a hope, but you couldn't hear it. You couldn't hear the good news. It's one of those where I was trying to remember which gospel it is, where it says that they dismissed what the women said as an idle tale. I think it's the Gospel of John. And it's just so infuriating, because it's like, oh, well, and here's the other thing I find this personally, maybe you don't. I find this incredibly frustrating. So the women came and say, Jesus has risen, right? The angel said, Jesus has risen, Jesus has risen. But they don't believe it. But when Jesus appears to Peter, then they're like, oh, Jesus is risen because he's finally appeared to a man. So clearly we can trust the word. It just drives me nuts. Anyway, and the only comfort I take in this is it doesn't just drive me nuts, but what is Jesus's response? From one of like compassion and gentleness and what's grieving, what has happened, to then they tell him that. And what does he say? Verse 25, this is, what you picked up on, Scott, which is, he says to them, you morons. Let's take a step back and let's remember a couple of things, right? First is, was there any indication that Jesus was going to die and then be resurrected?
Yes, he's
right?
Good.
At least 3 times Jesus says, by the way, we're going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be crucified, I'm going to be killed, and on the 3rd day I'm going to rise again. So it's one of those things of like, it's not like, well, I wish like Jesus, you should have mentioned something. No, they did. They definitely said something, and you just didn't believe that it would happen. And sometimes, I mean, it's understandable that they wouldn't, it's an extraordinary thing. But at the same time, like, That's part of it, right? And then in addition to that, obviously, they're fellow disciples whom they're discounting that voice. And yet in the Gospel of Luke, arguably more than any other gospel, the voices of women are lifted up to be equal to that of men. So for example, in the Gospel of Luke, as opposed to the Gospel of Matthew, who does the angel Gabriel come to say that Mary is going to give birth to the Son of God? Not to Joseph. Gospel of Matthew, it's Joseph. It's Mary, right? And then remember also, we have like Elizabeth, and we have this beautiful thing between Elizabeth and Mary, and we have this huge focus on women. It's the Gospel of Luke that says, listen, the only reason that Jesus is able to continue his ministry is because of Herod's housekeeper, the Herod's house manager, his wife, and other wealthy women paid for all of Jesus's ministry. And so we have this massive lifting up of women. So there is this kind of rebuke that I think does come from the fact that they're dismissing and not taking seriously the testimony of the women, when that's been a constant theme throughout the Gospel of Luke, of this especially at the time in such a patriarchal society, this incredible egalitarianism that happens in the kingdom of God. And so that's a piece that's lifted up here when he says how foolish you are, and then goes to declare the good news. There's another piece of this too, which is, are there other messages or themes in Scripture? Can you think of that? Talk about the fact that in moments of great despair, when you feel like your hopes have been in vain, have we heard in other pieces of Scripture before Jesus where that message comes that God is still with us? Right? So where is that message of hope that we've also received in Scripture? Yeah, Lorraine.
Being in the desert and the people were lost. They didn't believe that there was any hope really.
Yep.
And they were hungry, and so he gave them some manna and he gave them some pheasants, and they still complained and felt oppressed and lost.
Yeah.
Not necessarily oppressed, but lost.
Yeah. Right. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. The Book of Lamentations, right? The entire exile, the experience of the exile, the experience of the Exodus, as you bring up, Lorraine. This is this message of, even when you feel that all is lost, all is not lost, I am with you, is consistent from Genesis all the way through, right? This constant feeling of we've been abandoned, we're alone, we'd hoped that you would do this. I mean, look at the Psalms. The Psalms are over and over and over these complaints to God saying, listen, I've been faithful, God. What's the matter with you? You're supposed to have my back, right? Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, we have this piece. And so this is not something that's new with Jesus when it says that Jesus, beginning with Moses, right, and going through all the prophets. So Jesus is basically giving this Bible study and saying, listen, repeatedly for thousands of years, when people of God have felt, when the believers have felt like you do, they remember that God is with them. God does not abandon us. God does not leave you alone. This is not the end of the story. He understands that you may feel it's the end of the story, but it's not the end of the story. And this is not just about Jesus. Obviously, it is about Jesus, but it's not just about Jesus. It's about who God is. And God is not one that leaves us alone in the valley of the shadow of death. That's not who God is. We are, no matter how isolated, no matter how alone we feel, no matter how full of despair and doubt and questioning we feel, that's not who God is. Yeah, Wendy.
I think what I really love about verses 19 through 24, as we're talking about them, is in the context of how you just spoke about Lamentations and they need him. I think what I love about these verses is that it isn't
That's not who God is. Yeah, Wendy.
Sorry, I'm getting feedback. So
that's okay. You're good. I just muted it. It's good.
What am I trying to say? So I feel like a lot of the Bible stories are about, this is the situation, the people misunderstood, and God is here to answer those questions. God comes when we need him. But these verses just really, to me, speak about a huge confusion.
Mhm.
Sorry, I'm getting feedback. And I guess maybe it's just a reflection of my own confusion sometimes, where I can't even choose between disbelief and belief, but I'm just not seeing any signs. And so I really like these verses because they just speak to that kind of confusion.
Yeah, that's good. Tom and Eva, we're getting a delay coming back from you guys, so that's why I keep muting. So Tom, I see you there. So if you keep getting muted, that's because we were getting a feedback from you. So, oh, Hadley's putting up, faith is acting like it is so even when it is not so, so that it might be so simply because God said so. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it's one of those, I love that you bring that up, Wendy, too. And thanks for sharing that, Hadley, because Nancy Knott had put in on Facebook too, right? It's the rainbow after the storm, right? And so it's that piece of, like Martin Luther King Jr. said, it's taking the first step, not seeing the bottom. It's taking the first step on a stair without seeing the bottom of the staircase. You know, so we take that step. We don't know where it's going, but we have faith that we'll be able to get down there, right? That we'll be able to do that. And I think that that's the tricky thing, is how do we move forward in our life of faith, right? When everything's going perfectly, then that's the easiest time when it is, right? To believe in God and things. It's when things are awful, right? It's when things are really hard. It's when all evidence to the contrary. It's when Job is sitting there and all of his friends are saying, Job, you really messed up because God has cursed you. And recognizing, no, that's not how God works. That's not who God is. God is not one who abandons us when we need God the most. And
I guess I'm also trying to say that I often feel like, and I'm speaking metaphorically, like the drunk at the top of the stairs that is just going to stumble down because she doesn't know what she's doing.
But here's the thing. But what happens if you do, right? I mean, some of us eloquently make our way down the staircase of faith, right? And others of us kind of slip on the first step and end up tumbling down, you know, in a heap. But where does that staircase, while we may not see where the bottom of the staircase is, we know that God's still there to catch us, right? I mean, and I think that's the hard piece, right?
Right.
I think sometimes we feel like, so throw back to Indiana, and have any of you ever seen the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade?
Yes.
Right. So there's a part in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade where he's got to go through these trials, and there's a spot where he has to walk on the name of God. And so he has to step on just the right things to spell out the name Jehovah. And so he originally steps on the J, and then he remembers that there's no J, and he almost falls, blah, blah. You might remember that. Okay. I think often we think that that's what faith is. We need to know just right where to step, because if we take one wrong step, that's it. We fall to our doom, right? I love that movie, but that's a terrible metaphor. That's not how God works, right? If that was how God works, then the human experiment ends with Noah. Like, that's it, right? We remember God kills everybody, saves Noah, and then immediately after saving Noah and we have the rainbow, right? What does God say?
Won't do it again.
Yeah, he says, I won't do it again, but why won't I do it again? Because it didn't work.
Because of a covenant.
And he says, it didn't work. He goes, listen, I tried to just purify. I tried to get rid of all the bad people and only save the good people. But you know what I found out? Even the good people, they kind of suck. They're not that great, right? That's a paraphrase. He literally says, it says in the scripture, the human heart is inclined toward evil. It is we're predispositioned to do the wrong things, right? And so it's this idea of God knows exactly who we are, right? When we disobey God, when we don't love ourselves, much less others, much less God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, it's not like God is surprised by that. right? We don't have to walk the path of perfection. It's recognizing the grace. So I want to kind of jump ahead because this is a piece that, and Lois had talked, I don't know if Lois is still with us, but Lois had said something later, and then Dave Donnelly had talked about this. So I want to go ahead, I'm going to jump ahead to this because I've always heard this passage that it says their eyes were, they saw Jesus in the breaking of the bread, right? And some of you may have heard this. Have you heard this? Like it was in the road to Emmaus when Jesus broke the bread that their eyes were opened.
Mhm.
But I want you to look at verse 30 and 31. When were their eyes opened?
When he blessed and broke the bread.
And gave it
he
to
does
them.
4 things.
He gave it to them.
He takes the bread, he blesses the bread, he breaks the bread, and he gives them the bread. This is one of the things that I love about this passage. And I have to say, I always heard it was in the breaking of the bread. He was revealed in the breaking of the bread. I've heard sermons on he was revealed in the breaking of the bread. And I have a friend and colleague, Rob Mialis, who is a huge Greek nerd. And so all of my Greek stuff often comes from Rob. He does great stuff with Greek. And he points out, he goes, it's not in the breaking of the bread. It's in the receiving of the bread. So it's that piece of, and for me, I love it because it's this idea of grace, right? The grace is offered, right? It is taken, it is blessed, it is broken, it is offered to you. And it's the difference between knowing who Jesus is, knowing the story of Jesus, knowing all of the details, knowing the scriptures about Jesus and all of that. That's one piece, that's knowing Jesus. But the other piece is experiencing Jesus, and experiencing who Jesus was is recognizing that Jesus embodied that unconditional love and grace and is offering it to you. And when you receive it, it's in that moment that our eyes are open to the presence of Christ in our midst, right? It's in the receiving of the grace that's given to us and recognizing the fact that I'm not perfect. And not only am I not perfect now, I'm never going to be perfect, right? I'm never going to be without flaw. I'm never going to spend every second and every moment loving God with all my heart and all my soul and all my mind and all my strength. But God loves me, knowing exactly who I am. And so I'm going to keep trying each moment. Each moment, I'm going to keep trying to do even more and more and more, right? Because I know that I'm not like Jonathan Edwards, the famous Great Awakening revivalist congregational minister, said that we are but spiders on a thread dangling over the fires of hell, waiting to drop at any minute, right? We are not invited to love God because it's either God or eternal damnation and death. Rather, instead, we love God in recognition for a grace which has been received that we have done nothing to earn, right? It's the difference. It's a gratitude love, right? And that's the transformative piece. And I think that's the piece in this passage for me that speaks to me is and we'll jump into the Eucharistic things, right? But it's this idea that when they receive what God has given them, then they recognize that not even death can separate you from the love and grace of God. Right? They've seen Jesus broken, right? They saw Jesus who is taken and given to the earth. They saw Jesus who was blessed in the waters of baptism and on the Mount of Transfiguration. They saw Jesus tortured and broken, and yet that still, even in that process of death, did not keep grace from God, as is revealed in this giving of the bread, as they then receive that grace from God. And for me, that's the real good news out of this, and that's the foundation upon which the church is built, in this idea of how do we continue to encourage folks and proclaim that good news, right? That nothing can separate us. I just want to pause there and say, are there other things that are thoughts or comments or things that have stood out to you in that? Wendy, I'm going to lower your hand if that's okay. You're good. Did you guys all know, by the way, that there's a way you can raise your hand if you ever want to say something? There's like a little hand raising thing. If you click, I think you have to click on like participants or something, and then there's some buttons at the bottom and you can raise your hand too. So if you ever have something and you're like, I need a way to raise my hand, you can do that. It's kind of a fun thing.
Can I say one more thing about that?
Yeah, please.
Which is, after they realize what they've seen, they talk about their hearts burning.
Mm-hmm.
And again, not to harp on my own confusion, but I will say that in my confusion, my heart and my chest is actually physically burning often. And that is when I feel closest to speaking to God, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. It's an odd thing that the church, when everything is going well, the churches are typically empty. They're the emptiest. When everything is going to hell in a handbasket, except for now, obviously, because we can't be together, but this is when the churches are the fullest. So I don't know how many of you remember after 9/11, right? The churches were packed. And so it's an interesting thing that in those moments when it seems so clearly that, as the psalmist says, right, the enemies say, or it says, fools say there is no God. In those moments where it seems like if God is one whose sole purpose is to protect us from all harm and heartache, if that's the purpose of God, then of course, then it seems like there is no God. And yet what we find is in those moments, we actually find our heartstring drawn closer to God and pulled closer to God. Donna, I'm gonna mute you for a second because you're moving around and stuff. So you're just muted, but feel free to unmute yourself whenever. So very good.
Done that a long time ago.
All right. So a couple other things. Let's talk about a couple other things. So we have so I want to talk a little bit about, so when we have the table, so first of all, so they have scripture. He's going into the village. He's going to walk ahead as if he's going on. This was not a time when people traveled at night. It was almost evening. So when they tell him to stay with us, right? Stay with us, for it is almost evening and the day is nearly over. And it says he went in to stay with them, right? I mean, this is also an act of protection, of really watching over and caring for this stranger. Again, they still don't recognize that it's Jesus. But it was very dangerous to be traveling at night. And so there is this opening of their homes to them. There's this aspect of service. This is one of the things. So we've had scripture, which is important, that we are part of a deeper, longer story of the people of faith. That story moves us to service, right? And that service moves us to deeper fellowship. And so it's not just that they invite him in, but then they break bread with them. Especially in the ancient world, when you broke bread with somebody, it was a way of inviting them into your family. It was a very powerful thing to do. To break bread with someone was to invite someone into your inner circle. And often we still do this. I think I talked about this on a sermon like a couple of years ago and things, but it's the difference between who you're willing to have a cup of coffee with and who you're willing to have lunch with. Right? So which by the way, then immediately after I said that, like 4 people who I'd had coffee with were like, I see, you didn't want to spend time with me. So no, but there is, like, we have these degrees of how much we're willing to do something with someone, right? And like, if you're gonna meet somebody out for lunch, back when we used to actually be able to go out and meet someone out for lunch, right? You're stuck there for an extended period of time because you've got to wait and order your food and then eat your food and then do those you can't just grab your coffee and jet if things get weird or uncomfortable, right? But that's about as close as we get now to these nowadays things of like this inner circle of inviting people in. And so this is an idea that they're inviting him in, they're breaking bread together. It's a way of really inviting this stranger into their midst. And then we have the famous Eucharistic, so the 4 verbs. Took, blessed, broke, and gave. These are the Eucharistic verbs. We've heard these at the Last Supper. Before supper, Jesus took the bread, blessed the bread, broke the bread, gave the bread. But also in the Gospel of Luke, the Synoptic, and all the Gospels, also we remember the feeding of the multitude, which again comes back to this idea of the feeding of the multitude. There's not enough. Jesus says, bring who you are, bring what you have. They bring what they have. They bring the fish and the loaves. Jesus takes them, blesses them, breaks them, and then gives them. then they share them, and there is abundance, unimaginable abundance. They feed 15,000 people, and there's baskets of leftovers afterward, right? And so once again, in this moment, when they were feeling deep scarcity, right? There's not enough. We had hoped. Our hopes had been in vain. Nothing is working out. In this midst, they're also reminded of the miraculous abundance, that God is a God of abundance and abundant life, and not a God of scarcity. Humans tend to be inclined towards scarcity, right? Best evidence of this, as far as scarcity, how many of you have been to the grocery store in the last couple of weeks?
Mhm.
Right?
It's scarce.
Yes, right? Like you go to the toilet paper or the aisle or the Purell aisle, and that's a scarcity mindset. Here's the thing. There's plenty of toilet paper for everyone. There is. We don't have a toilet paper shortage in this country, but we have a perceived shortage of there's not enough of something. And so I need it all. We don't even actually have a hand sanitizer shortage. We actually have more hand sanitizer than ever, because just about every major distillery, and Lord knows we love our hard alcohol, is cranking out hand sanitizer like crazy. We have more hand sanitizer I have this distillery that keeps sending me emails, and they're like, we've got tons of hand sanitizer. Please take it. It's on sale. Like, we have all this stuff, but we have this perceived idea of there's not enough, right? And again, I think that it's often an inclination. It's
Eric,
not just
when we talk.
Yep. Go ahead, Lorraine.
When we talk perceptions,
Yeah.
I've always been troubled in all of the stories each time that Christ isn't being recognized after the resurrection.
Yeah.
That, is he the gardener? Who is he? How did he get in the room? They don't recognize. And I'm wondering if part of that, I'm like, how can they not recognize him? He's who they've been with. How different can he be? Or what is he that they can see him at all and not recognize him? But I'm wondering if a part of what we're to be learning here is to look for the Christ in everyone. The person walking with them was a stranger, but in that stranger, they found Christ, whether it was the Christ that had been crucified or whether it was a strong believer who was had Christ in his own heart that made the difference. And that the message to us shouldn't really be, how could they not recognize him, which is, like I say, always been an issue for me, but recognize him, look for him everywhere, in anyone, in everyone.
Right. I mean, how do I not recognize Christ in every person that I meet?
Because we don't always show him to you.
but it's also one of those, it's an interesting thing, right? So like the women coming and saying, Christ is risen, we have received the good news that Christ is with us and within us, each of us. And yet, how often do I spend my life, shuffling my road back to Emmaus, despondent and despairing because I have not seen the gift of Christ that is around me, the blessings that are around me, the people, the Christ in you, and the Christ, the Christ in all of us. And also the Christ in the people that really, like you said, Lorraine, not everybody shows us. The Christ that we see is not always the Christ we want to see. And maybe this is a good story and comes back to Scott's thing, right? Because when I think of Jesus, I think of a warm, fuzzy Jesus who loves me. He walks with me and he talks with me and he tells me I am his own, right? That's what I want. I don't want Jesus coming and saying, Eric, you're an idiot. That's not the Jesus I want. Come on. But this is the Jesus that is, right? They needed somebody to be wake up, open your eyes. Christ is in front of you. I love that idea, Lorraine. I think you're absolutely right. I think that's what all of these post-resurrection experiences are, when they're trying to figure out, how do we continue to live when Jesus isn't with us? And over, where they're shown, no, Jesus is with you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So even the crazy coworker who drives me crazy is putting me on a new path.
Right. And urging us, and there are possibilities for new life and new opportunity and new love and new grace and all of that. Absolutely. Yeah. So go ahead, Scott.
I wonder if you wanted to share your story when you were serving in the Middle East and you came down off that mountain.
So in 2000, I was in the Middle East and outside of Beit Shean, which is if you think of the West Bank as a kidney bean, it's at the kind of the northern area, just outside of the West Bank in Israel proper. Anyway, I was doing an archaeological dig there, and then we went on a hike up Mount Gilboa, which is this big mountain. It would be a mountain for us Midwesterners. For places where they actually have mountains, it would not be considered a mountain. But we hiked, and I mean, we've been hiking all day. That was one of the hottest summers that they had in 2000 in Israel. So during the middle of the day, it would get up to 52 degrees Celsius, which is like 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was hot and humid. So you might say like, well, it's the desert, it's a dry heat. No, it's the Jordan River Valley. So it's just like hiking through just hot soup. It's just gross. And so just imagine like we'd spend hours hiking up this mountain, and then we were coming down the mountain, and we came down the mountain on the wrong side. And so we got lost. And so when we came down the mountain, we came into this village, sweaty and dirty and dusty and just gross. And as we're walking through this village, we're kind of rubbernecking because at one of the houses, they have these big courtyards, all this stuff was going on. And there was all this commotion and people happening and things like that. And we were kind of looking, and then some children saw us, and then all these kids came out and kind of surrounded us. And we were chatting with them, and then the father, the man of the house, came out and invited us into the courtyard. And then the women, that we were immediately separated, men from women, and so all the women went inside and all the men stayed outside. And they brought out food, and there was all this food and stuff, and they had broken English and our Arabic was terrible, and we were trying to figure out what was going on. And what we found out was it was the middle of a wedding. It was the man's daughter was having a wedding, but it's a Palestinian thing. Is hospitality is so ingrained that you do not let strangers pass without welcoming them in. So literally, they invited us into the wedding. I was wearing like, if you know, like those white t-shirts, like a sleeveless, like what people so often call like the ribbed like A shirts. Like it was like an undershirt, and it was sweaty, and it was disgusting and stinky and gross and miserable. And here we are at a wedding with all these people dressed to the nines, and they're giving us food, and we're invited to the wedding banquet when we were the last people that should have been at the wedding. Not to mention the fact that we were, for me, like I was there, and then I found out they were Palestinians, and all I'd heard about Palestinians was that all Palestinians are terrorists and want to kill me and hate Americans. And so here they had welcomed us Americans in, and at this wedding in this extravagant hospitality. And then at the end, so we were there for probably 2 or 3 hours. We had an amazing conversation, a huge feast. It was super fun. And then they all drove us home at the end of the night. It was hospitality that was unbelievable. I mean, you couldn't even begin to imagine. It was like crashing a wedding, except they were like, hey, come in and crash this wedding. I mean, it was such a weird and wonderful and magical and extraordinary thing. I've never quite experienced anything since, but that's it. I mean, in that moment, we talked about everything. We talked about life and politics and farming and all sorts. I mean, we just had one of the most magical and amazing evenings that we'd ever had. Because of that radical hospitality. And like you were saying, Lorraine, like Christ was there. Christ was in our midst. I hadn't thought about that in this context, Scott, but yeah, it was cool. It was a cool thing.
And you got there because you were lost on the wrong side of the mountain.
Absolutely. If I hadn't been lost, and I have to tell you, like, as we were walking through that town and it was getting dark, we were like, what are we going to do? Like we literally have no idea where we are, right? This was before cell phones, so nobody has a cell phone. Like most of us don't speak either Hebrew or Arabic. So that's, we're out there and we're in the middle of the countryside. I mean, put that on the flip side. Now let's look at it the other side. Imagine a group of Palestinians in central Illinois getting lost in some farm town, right? Like imagine how that would have worked out, right? Hopefully.
The hospitality of our jails.
Yeah, right. So it's anyway, it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. So what else speaks to you in this? So they have this Eucharistic moment, their eyes are open, he immediately vanishes from their sight, which again, I feel like Lorraine goes back to this idea of this recognition that Christ is with us and within us, right? That idea of seeing seeing what's going on, right? But then it's also interesting where it says in verse 33, there's also this weird thing, right? So verse 33 says that same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem. Why is that weird?
What were they going to do in Jerusalem?
They had just left Jerusalem.
Well, they just left Jerusalem. What are they going to do when they get there? But even more than that, it says, specifically think of the time, that same hour.
Dark.
It's nighttime.
It's nighttime, right?
Yeah.
And we've already said that the night is not a safe time. And we already know that they are sad and fearful, right? There's this sad and this fear and all this stuff that's dominating those disciples. But when they realize that they're not alone, when they realize that Jesus is with them and within them, what happens to that fear? Are they dominated by that fear?
No.
No, right? So they're able to risk extravagantly in order to share the good news. And so they risk the roads. They go back out the roads to kind of carry that good news forward, and to do that. And that recognition that Jesus is with them makes the darkness less frightening. And then this is my least favorite part of the story. They come back and they're like, oh, well, Jesus has appeared to Simon, so now it's true.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Clearly, Mary and the Marys didn't make the cut, but now that it's Simon, the guy who denied Jesus 3 times, well, he's a reliable source. Anyway, whatever. So they've got that. But then they share this idea of how and that's where we have it, right? So then they said what had happened and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. And just coming back to that, like, I think it's as much in the receiving of the bread as it was in the breaking of the bread, right? That we have that combination. But also in the same time, too, that there's this idea of each of those verbs is important, right? And so I think Henry Nouwen has done some great work. A lot of other people have, but I love this those Eucharistic verbs of take, blessed, broke, and gave. And the idea that each of that defines who we are as followers, as believers in God, right? We have been taken, we have been chosen, we have been selected to be followers of God. We have been blessed in the waters of baptism, and we have been broken. Each of us is broken. Each of us is incomplete. None of us can do it on our own. None of us can do it alone. And each of us then is given back into the world to carry that good news, right? So it's not a chosen to be placed above and beyond. It's a chosen for, right? In the same way that Israel is saved from slavery in order to carry the good news, to be a blessing to all nations, to carry that good news to the world. So we have been chosen, and we have a responsibility to carry that good news of new life.
I think there should be another verb there, received, because just like a conversation isn't really communication unless the person hears and could repeat back what was actually meant by the person speaking.
Yeah.
So just that something is given, shrug your shoulders and so what? But if you receive it, then you have it.
Yeah.
Then you live it.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's at the heart of grace, right? It's the grace is freely given. The question is, are we willing to receive it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe that's why the first verb is take. It's sort of cyclical. You give and then you take, and then you are blessed, and then you thank, and then you give, and then you take, and then you bless. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
How many of you have, when you've given something, find out that in the giving of something, you actually received more than you feel like you gave?
Oh, often.
Yeah. Like the two are so interwoven, this idea. And I love the idea that it is cyclical. It is cyclical. Right? We are repeatedly broken. Sometimes we break ourselves. We do things to ourselves that break ourselves. Sometimes we are broken from things from the outside, right? But we are repeatedly broken. I feel repeatedly blessed, not just in baptism, not just at other times, but there are times when I just think, thank you. Like I am just overwhelmed by blessing. So I think that these ideas that it's none of these is a one and done, but it's this pattern, it's this journey of faith, right? Which again is one of the things is, I think probably one of the pieces that I love about this story and the metaphors, right, is that where does Jesus meet us? Jesus meets us on the road. Right? We're on the journey of faith. It's not at the destination. We don't have to get someplace to meet Jesus. Jesus has been there with us the whole time. Jesus is with us in the journey. Jesus is with us on the road. And of course, the irony too, coming back to this, Wendy, is something that you said, which is this idea of, I think it was Wendy. This idea of like moving on, right? He walked as if he were going on. Does Jesus move on?
No,
Who does?
we do.
We do.
Right? The disciples move on. So the funny thing is there's this twist of fate in which Jesus says he's going to move on. He's invited in, and in Jesus, they're encouraged to keep the journey going. They think their journey has come to the end. They've come home. They've reached their destination. But what they've realized is that their journey is just beginning. And so there's this kind of this fun, again, there's these fun reversals that happen in Scripture. And this is one of those where it's Jesus has gone ahead, and now it's our turn to go forward and carry that good news. All right, we're coming closer to the end of our time. I want to see if there's any last questions or comments or thoughts. I'm looking at our folks on Facebook. They're chiming in. Maridel's with us there too. She's been chiming in as well. Are there other pieces, good news, questions that you have? So next week, we're going to be talking about Matthew 28 and the post-resurrection story in Matthew. And the most famous piece of that is going to be the Great Commission, right? So when we talk about the Great Commission, which was kind of the missional paradigm for a long time in the church. We're going to talk a little bit about that, about like what's the purpose of the church and what that looks like. So go forth, the Great Commission, go forth and make disciples of all nations, baptizing all people in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's the only time that Jesus talks about the Trinity. Interesting trivia piece, by the way. So when you're hanging out with your friends on Zoom and playing Bible trivia, which I'm sure you all are, there you go. You can use that. So we're going to talk a bit about that, and about that Trinitarian language, about a lot of those different pieces, about what that means in that Great Commission. And then, so that's what we're going to do next week. Reminder that tonight at 5 o'clock, there is a communion service. So if you would like to take, bless, and break the bread. Actually, I don't know if you've been doing that. There are a couple things. So I just want to send this out to folks. So there are a couple things that we could really use your help, everybody's help with, if you're willing to do it. One is, if you've been participating in your communion service, and if it's possible, if there are other people in your house, or if you're just able to film yourself celebrating communion. Because the one thing that I miss is, right, so and in this passage, we hear that they saw him in the breaking of the bread. I know that we're all breaking bread together. I miss being able to see you break bread with me. And so we want to kind of put together some of that. So if you have if you can take a small video of yourself breaking bread, you can just email that to me. We're going to send a video or an email out later that will have a link to a Google Drive. You can upload it there, but you could also just email it to me. Also, if you want to participate in worship, we would love to have more voices in worship. So if you want to record yourself either doing the Great Commandment and the Lord's Prayer, or doing whoever you are, wherever you are in life, saying whoever you are, wherever you are in life's journey, you're welcome here. Same thing, just email those to me, or at eric@fcc-cl.org. Or you can wait for that email that you're going to get later today, and that'll tell you how to upload it. But we'd love to have more of those voices. As much as I know people have been very gracious in enjoying watching my kids do it.
They were adorable.
There are a lot more other people. They've enjoyed doing it, but there's a lot more to the church than just the Fissler family. We'd love to have all of your voices and faces doing that. So if you're willing to do that, that would be excellent. We would love to have you do that with us. So.
I do have to say that Sam and Axel are a hard act to follow.
I appreciate that. Well, I mean, if you can say commandments, then you've got Axel beat it. He does keep asking me. He goes, this week, like he'll be like, "Can I do the Great Commander again?" And I'm like, it's still not Commander, but that's okay.
That's close enough, Eric.
Yes. Yeah.
He's a little boy.
It's the best. I love it. The other day he asked if we could go play in the basement. Not basement, the basement. It was great. I love it. Love those little things. So anyway, that email is going to be coming later today. But thank you all for joining us for this Bible study. It's been great to be with you as we kind of walk this journey of faith together. I love these post-resurrection stories because it's all a question of, now that everything has changed, what do we do now? And I feel like that's at least how I'm feeling, and a lot of us are feeling during these weird times, which is, well, what do we do now that we can't be together? And how do we continue to love? And how do we reread the scriptures in new ways? And so it's been great to do this with you. All right.
Continuing to be in touch and continuing to love. I text with Antanas occasionally, and he had sent along greetings to the church and to the members.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for saying that. Please say hi to him for me. That's wonderful.
Who was that?
Who?
Antanas, our Lithuanian
Oh, yes.
member.
Yeah.
Where is he?
He's in Chicago. He has another caregiver position that keeps him full-time.
Yeah.
So he's not in Crystal Lake on Sunday morning, even if we were having church service, well, he wouldn't be there.
Oh, we'll say hi to him. Yeah.
Has been, in my opinion, a great addition to our congregation. He did so much for Steve Carlson.
Yes.
And
He also speaks like 6 languages, which is crazy.
I know he's just a cheerful and face, and you know that he's ready to help. That's what I can see on his face. But of course, I couldn't remember exactly what his name was. But then,
well, it took a while to figure out how to pronounce it.
I think so.
Great. Well, take care, everyone. God bless you all. It's been wonderful to have you all with us. And hopefully we'll see you tonight at communion. Also a reminder, tomorrow at noon is the midday music service, so you can check that out as well. Take care, everybody. God bless.
Okay.